No one in the audience could have imagined what was about to happen. The cameras were rolling, the lights warm and steady, laughter echoing through the Family Feud stage, the kind that usually bounces off walls and hearts alike. Steve Harvey stood center stage, cue cards in hand, the master of rhythm and laughter, ready to spark another round of good-natured competition. But then, he looked at the small figure standing across from him, a boy no older than 11, with calm brown eyes and a gentle, grounded stillness that didn't quite belong to a child his age. And something in the room shifted. It wasn't his fame that caught people off guard. Everyone knew who he was. Ryan Kaji. The boy who had built an empire unboxing toys, whose laughter had reached millions of screens and living rooms. But this wasn't the Ryan people were used to seeing. He wasn't surrounded by toys or balloons or bright colors. He stood quietly between his parents, holding a single small object in his hand. A worn wooden toy truck, faded at the edges, polished smooth by time and touch. Steve noticed the toy immediately. "Now hold on," he said, smiling. "That little thing right there that looks older than both of us combined." The boy looked up at him shyly. "It's from when we didn't have much," Ryan said softly. His voice trembled just enough for the audience to lean in. Steve tilted his head, sensing the weight behind those few words. "Tell me about that," he said gently. Ryan hesitated, looking down at the toy. The lights above caught in his hair, turning the moment into something almost cinematic, the stillness before a truth that changes everything. "When I was little," he said, "this was all I had to play with. My dad made it for me out of old wood because we couldn't buy new toys. And I promised myself that if I ever had more, I'd share it." The audience went silent. Even the hum of the studio lights seemed to fade. Steve blinked, his usual quick wit replaced by a kind of quiet awe. "Son," he said softly, "you kept that promise, didn't you?" Ryan nodded. His mother smiled through tears. His father stood proudly behind him, hands folded. "We started something," Ryan said, his small voice steady now. "It's called the Bright Box Project. We use the money from my channel to buy school supplies, food, and clothes for kids who don't have much. We built our first library last year in the Philippines, and one in Texas last month." A gasp moved through the audience that sound people make when their hearts recognize something pure. Steve set his cue cards down completely. He didn't need them anymore. "You know what's crazy?" he said, voice cracking slightly. "Most grown folks wouldn't think like that. You could have just kept buying toys and nobody would have blamed you. But you decided to give instead. That's something special." Ryan shrugged, almost embarrassed. "It just felt right," he said. "I used to think happiness was getting things. But it's not. It's giving them." The crowd broke into applause, but Steve held up a hand not to stop them, but to let the moment breathe. "Now see," he said, quietly. "That right there is wisdom. That's purpose. And it came out the mouth of a child." Ryan's mom reached for her son's shoulder, smiling with pride and tenderness. "He's always had a big heart," she said. "He told us one day, 'I don't want to just be the kid with toys. I want to be the kid who helps other kids smile again.'" The camera zoomed in on Steve's face, his eyes glossy, his usual grin softened into something deeper. "Man," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's what it's all about." He looked back at Ryan. "You remind me of something my mama used to say," Steve began, his voice thick with emotion. She said, "You can't take none of this with you when you go. So, while you're here, you better make it count. And you, young man, you making it count." Ryan smiled shyly, clutching the little wooden truck tighter in his hands. "I think my dad made this for a reason," he said softly. "It's old, but it still works. Kinda like kindness." The room fell completely silent. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from shock, it comes from reverence, from realization. Steve turned toward the audience, eyes glistening. "Did y'all hear that? Like kindness." His voice trembled slightly. "Boy, you just preached a whole sermon." And then, with a half smile, half tear, he said, "Some people come on this show and win a car. But today, we just got something better, a lesson we needed." The The cameras panned over the audience, grown men wiping tears, mothers clutching their children's hands. The lights softened, catching the reflection of that tiny toy truck as it gleamed faintly in Ryan's hands, a small, simple object carrying a story big enough to quiet a room. Steve took one last look at Ryan and said quietly, "You didn't just change toys, son. You changed hearts." And for the first time in a long time, the laughter on Family Feud gave way to something deeper, something still, sacred, and unforgettable. When the show cut to a break, Steve Harvey didn't move. The music faded, the lights dimmed, and yet he stood there, eyes fixed on the boy who had just turned the loudest stage in television into something that felt like a church. Ryan Kaji sat quietly beside his parents, legs swinging a little off the stool they'd set up for him. He wasn't basking in attention or fame. He was drawing little circles on the edge of his note card with a pen the stage manager had given him. A child, still. But there was something ancient in the stillness of his presence, something Steve couldn't quite shake. He finally spoke, voice low and reflective. "You know, when I was your age, I didn't know what purpose meant. I thought you had to grow up to figure that out. But you out here showing the world it ain't about age. It's about heart." Ryan looked up at him, thoughtful. "My mom says kindness is like light," he said. "Even a little bit can fill a whole room." Steve smiled gently, his throat tightening again. "You sure your mama ain't a poet?" The audience laughed softly. But it wasn't the laughter of a game show, it was the laughter of people trying to hold back tears. Ryan's mother, Loanne, smiled modestly. "We just tell him to remember what matters," she said. "When the videos got big, we were scared. It's easy to lose yourself when millions of people are watching. But one day he said, 'Mom, maybe we can use this to help someone.' And that's how it started." Steve nodded slowly. "Started with a thought. That's how most great things begin." He crouched down slightly, lowering the mic so he was eye level with Ryan. "Tell me, little man, what made you decide to start that scholarship fund?" Ryan hesitated, twisting the toy truck in his hands. His voice came soft but steady. "I met a boy last year at a shelter," he said. "He told me he wanted to be a scientist, but he couldn't go to school. I couldn't stop thinking about him. I kept wondering what would happen if no one helped him. So I thought, maybe I can." Silence. Then, applause. But not loud, not rowdy, the kind of applause that sounds like gratitude. Steve covered his mouth for a moment, breathing in deeply. "You know what, son? You just reminded a lot of folks what blessings are for." He looked up toward the audience. "See? A blessing ain't meant to sit still. It's meant to move, to flow. And when you use yours to lift somebody else, that's when you really understand why God gave it to you." The camera cut to Ryan's parents, his father, Shion, wiping at the corner of his eye, and his mother holding his shoulder gently. Steve turned back to Ryan. "You got something rare," he said. "The world gave you a platform, and instead of building yourself higher, you built a bridge for other folks to walk across." Ryan blinked up at him. "I just think everyone should have a chance," he said simply, "because kindness doesn't run out. The more you give, the more you get." The audience rose again, slowly, emotionally. People were standing, some clapping, some whispering prayers, others holding each other's hands. Steve looked down, smiling softly. This boy talking like he 80 years old. Laughter broke through the tears, but Steve's eyes glistened as he stood again. "Let me tell you something, Ryan," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You might not know it yet, but you changing the way kids see the world. You're teaching them that being famous don't mean nothing if you don't do something good with it." Ryan tilted his head, thoughtful. "My teacher says fame is a tool," he said. "But tools are only good if you build something that helps people." Steve's mouth fell open slightly. He shook his head, pacing a few steps before looking out at the crowd. "Lord, this child is preaching again." The audience roared laughter mixing with tears. Steve took a moment, hand on his heart. "See, this is why I love doing this show," he said softly. "'Cause every now and then, somebody walks in and reminds me why we're here." He turned back to Ryan. "You know what, son? I meet a lot of people on this stage, but you gon' stay with me. You gon' remind me to keep my own light on." Ryan smiled bashfully. "You already do that, Mr. Harvey." Steve chuckled. "Well, I'ma try to keep up with you, little man." The producer off stage motioned to cue music, but Steve waved her off. "Nah, don't play nothing yet," he said. "This moment don't need no soundtrack." The studio fell still again. The air seemed thicker, filled with emotion and reverence. It wasn't a taping anymore. It was something else, something sacred. Steve placed his hand on Ryan's shoulder. "Let me tell you something," he said, voice trembling now. "What you did, what you keep doing, that's redemption, son. You took something small, something the world called simple, and you turned it into purpose. You're showing people that kindness ain't weakness, it's strength." Ryan looked up at him and whispered, "My dad says it's the only strength that never hurts anyone." And just like that, the audience wept again. Steve closed his eyes, whispering, "Lord, you sent this boy here for a reason." The stage lights dimmed slightly, leaving a soft golden halo around them. The host, the boy, and that little wooden truck resting between them on the podium. And in that quiet moment, the Family Feud stage didn't feel like a game show anymore. It felt like a classroom for the soul. When the show resumed after the break, the atmosphere was completely different. Gone was the usual buzz of anticipation and playful competitiveness. Instead, there was a calm warmth, the kind of quiet energy that fills a church after a hymn. Even the studio lights seemed softer, wrapping the stage in an amber glow that felt almost sacred. Steve Harvey stood at his podium, still visibly moved. He had hosted thousands of episodes, met hundreds of families. But this was different. There were no punchlines that could fit here, no scripted joy that could top what had just unfolded. He turned slowly toward the audience and said in a low, trembling voice, "Every now and then, God sneaks a little reminder in here, just to show us that the world still got some good in it." The audience nodded, murmuring softly, as if agreeing in prayer. He turned back to Ryan. "Son, you sitting on this stage representing something much bigger than a show. You represent the reason we all keep going, the proof that good hearts can still grow out of chaos." Ryan looked up at him with that same quiet sincerity, his feet barely touching the floor. "My mom says the world is like a garden," he said. "If we don't take care of it, it won't grow, so we have to be the gardeners." The entire audience reacted with a collective, "Ah!" But it wasn't just admiration. It was reverence, the deep kind that comes when innocence speaks truth. Steve chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You sure you only 10? Ryan giggled. "Almost 11. "Mm-hmm," Steve said with mock suspicion. "I think you got an old soul hiding in that little body." The laughter returned light, cleansing, human. For a moment, it brought balance back into the room. But just as Steve was about to move to the next cue, something inside him stopped him cold. He set down his cue cards again, walked to the front of the stage, and addressed the audience directly. "Let me tell y'all something," he began, pacing slowly. "We live in a world where folks talk a lot about fame. Everybody want to be known. Everybody want to go viral. But this little man right here," he pointed to Ryan, "he just reminded us that being known don't mean nothing if you ain't known for something good." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the rows of faces. "You see, there's something called divine purpose. And sometimes it don't wait for you to grow up to find you. Sometimes it finds you early. Sometimes it finds you when you hold in a little wooden truck and a dream." Ryan looked down at the toy again, the one his father had carved long before the fame, before the cameras, before the sponsors and headlines. It was a piece of their old life, one that carried a kind of honesty money could never buy. Steve noticed his expression and said softly, "You still got that little truck with you, huh?" Ryan nodded. "I keep it to remind me where we started. My dad says the first thing you ever love tells you who you are." Steve's face tightened as he fought back tears. "Boy, your daddy raised you right," he said. "You hang on to that." The camera panned to the audience again, rows of people wiping their eyes, nodding, holding their loved ones close. In the control room, the producers watched in silence. No one dared cut to commercial. Even the network director murmured into his headset, "Let it run." And then, Ryan's mother, her voice trembling with pride, spoke softly. "When Ryan said he wanted to start helping other children, we didn't think it would be this big," she said. "He just wanted to give away backpacks and books." But people started donating, and before we knew it, kids were writing to us from everywhere. India, Nigeria, Brazil, saying they finally had school supplies because of his videos. Steve raised a hand to his mouth, overwhelmed. "Man, I've been in this business 40 years, he said quietly. "I've seen people do a lot with success, but I ain't seen many use it like that." Ryan smiled shyly. "I think the world is better when kids help kids." That line hit Steve hard. He turned away, his back to the cameras for a few seconds, breathing deeply. When he turned back around, his voice was steady but soft. You right, son. We just forgot how simple it can be." The boy looked at him with curious eyes. "You think adults forget how to be kind sometimes?" Steve smiled sadly. "Yeah," he said, "'cause somewhere along the way, we start thinking kindness gotta be earned. But you remind us, it's free." A long pause followed. The audience was completely still, no sound, except the faint hum of the lights. It was as if everyone in that room was holding their breath at the same time. Then, Steve did something he almost never did on camera. He kneeled down. Eye to eye with Ryan, he said softly, "I hope you never lose this, son. This thing you got, it's rare. The world gon' try to change you. It's gon' tell you to chase things that don't last, but you just keep cassin' purpose, and I promise the rest can follow." Ryan nodded seriously. "That's what my grandma says too." Steve laughed through the tears forming in his eyes. "Man, y'all got a whole family of philosophers." The crowd laughed too, but when Steve reached out and shook Ryan's hand, it turned into a standing ovation, a long, emotional applause that didn't fade quickly. Steve looked back at the audience, his eyes shining under the lights. "See, y'all?" he said. "This right here, this is what the world needs to see. Not just laughter, not just games, but hope. This young man brought that here today, and I ain't never gonna forget it." The applause built again, louder this time, rolling through the studio like a wave. Ryan smiled bashfully, clutching his wooden toy in both hands. "Thank you, Mr. Harvey," he said softly. Steve's voice cracked as he answered, "No, son, thank you." The audience was still standing long after the applause faded, many of them unsure what to do next. It wasn't every day that a game show turned into something that felt like a sermon about the soul of humanity. The Family Feud stage, usually alive with humor, fast answers, and laughter, now felt like a sanctuary, still humming with the quiet aftershock of something bigger than entertainment. Steve Harvey exhaled, pressing his hand against the edge of the podium to steady himself. "You know," he said softly, "when you do this job long enough, you get used to the noise, the jokes, the cheers, the chaos. But every now and then, somebody walks in and reminds you that sometimes silence is the loudest sound of all." He looked back at Ryan, the little boy sitting there with his small hands wrapped around that wooden truck. His parents watched him with the kind of love that radiates peace, the kind that's been through storms and come out stronger. The cameras panned in closer. Steve turned slightly toward the boy. "Let me ask you something, son," he said gently. "When you give to other kids, what do you think about?" Ryan took a long breath before answering. "I think about what it feels like to not have something you need. I think about the kids who go to sleep hungry or scared. I just want them to feel like someone sees them." That answer broke Steve. He covered his mouth, nodding slowly, trying to steady his voice. "That right there," he whispered. "That's what love sounds like." The audience grew emotional again. You could see people reaching for tissues, some nodding through tears. It wasn't a reaction to fame or money. It was recognition, the kind that hits deep, because it reminds you of something you've forgotten, your own softness. Steve looked up at the ceiling lights, blinking back the tears. "We spend so much time trying to teach kids how to grow up," he said. "But maybe we need to start learning from them instead." A murmur of agreement spread across the studio. Even the camera operators moved their lenses steady, but their eyes glassy. Ryan's dad, Shion, spoke up for the first time. His voice was calm, thick with emotion. "When Ryan started his channel, it was just for fun," he said. "We never imagined it would become this. But when he saw what was happening in the world, the wars, the kids without homes, the schools closing, he said, 'Dad, we should help.' And we couldn't tell him no." Loanne nodded beside him. "We told him if we're going to do this, it has to come from the heart." And he never stopped. Steve walked toward them slowly, microphone in hand, his tone reverent. "You raised him right. You didn't just teach him to dream, you taught him to give." Loanne smiled, tears slipping down her face. "We just wanted him to remember that blessings aren't meant to stop with you." That line struck Steve like lightning. He repeated it softly, as if letting the words sink into the air. "Blessings aren't meant to stop with you." He looked out at the audience, his voice thick and trembling. "That's the sermon of the day, y'all." The audience clapped, not the kind of applause that breaks tension, but the kind that acknowledges truth. It rolled through the room like a heartbeat. Then Ryan, still holding that little toy, said something no one expected. "Mr. Harvey," he said, "I think my favorite thing isn't when people say thank you. It's when they promise they'll help someone else too." Steve's eyes widened. "Lord, have mercy," he said, half laughing, half crying. "You 10 years old and you already teachin' multiplication of kindness." Laughter rippled through the room again, gentle, full, and healing. But when the laughter faded, Steve's expression softened into something tender and still. He crouched beside Ryan again and said quietly, "You know, son, you gonna make a lot of people believe again. 'Cause sometimes the world starts to forget that kindness still exists, and then somebody like you walks in and proves it ain't gone nowhere." Ryan smiled shyly. "I think kindness is like air," he said. "Even if you can't see it, it's always there. You just have to breathe it back into people." A hush fell again, the kind of silence that feels sacred. Steve turned to the audience. "You heard that?" he said softly. "Breathe it back into people." He looked out across the room, his voice cracking. "That right there, that's a message for all of us. Maybe that's what we're supposed to be doing. Maybe that's how we fix this world, one breath, one act, one kindness at a time." People stood up again. Another standing ovation. Longer, louder, more emotional than the last. Steve wiped his eyes, chuckling through his tears. "Man, I ain't even playing no more. This ain't Family Feud, this family faith." The laughter broke through again, but it was layered with gratitude. Everyone knew they were witnessing something they'd never forget. The show wrapped shortly after, but no one wanted to leave. Crew members lingered, hugging quietly. Audience members walked up to Ryan's parents, shaking their hands, whispering blessings. Steve stayed until the last camera stopped rolling, then walked over and knelt beside the boy one last time. He put a hand over Ryan's. "You got a good heart, son. Don't ever let this world take that from you." Ryan nodded, looking up with his small, radiant smile. "I won't, Mr. Harvey. I promise." And then, with the whole studio watching, Steve leaned in close and said something the cameras didn't quite catch, but those near the stage could hear it. "You didn't come here to play a game today. You came here to remind us how to be human again." The audience cried softly, applause rippling once more as Steve stood up, hand pressed to his chest. And for a brief, beautiful moment, before the lights dimmed, before the credits rolled, you could feel the truth of what had just happened. A boy had come to a stage built for laughter, and instead gave the world back its heart. When the final applause subsided, the studio lights faded to a dusky gold. The Family Feud stage, normally buzzing with energy, felt as still as a photograph. The air carried the kind of warmth that lingers after something divine has passed through. Crew members wiped their eyes as they began packing up cables and cameras. Some smiled quietly at one another, still unsure how to describe what they'd just witnessed. Steve Harvey remained where he was, standing alone at the center of the stage. The wooden truck Ryan had left behind sat on the edge of the podium, tiny, imperfect, yet radiant beneath the stage lights. He stared at it for a long time, his hands clasped in front of him. He whispered under his breath, "Ain't that something? God sent a child to remind us how to love again." Ryan and his family were backstage now, surrounded by crew members who couldn't help but thank them not for being celebrities, but for being reminders of hope. One woman from the audience walked up to Loanne and pressed something into her hand, a folded photo of her own son. "He passed last year," she said softly. "But listening to your boy today, it helped me breathe again." Loanne hugged her. Neither said anything else. They didn't have to. Meanwhile, Steve stepped off the stage and walked down the hallway toward his dressing room. The laughter from earlier felt like it had happened days ago. He sat down heavily in his chair, took off his jacket, and looked at himself in the mirror, the man who'd built a career on humor, now sitting quietly in tears. His producer, Dana, knocked on the door and peeked in. "You good?" Steve nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm just thinking." "About the kid?" He smiled faintly. About what he said. "Kindness is like air." Lord, that hit me. That little boy got more wisdom than most folks twice my age. Dana nodded. He changed the energy in that whole building. I've never seen anything like it. Steve looked down at the small piece of paper sitting on his makeup counter, Ryan's handwritten thank you note, left behind before they left the set. The words were simple, but they hit like a prayer. "Thank you for letting me share my story. I hope people remember to help each other. That's how we all win." Steve ran a hand over his face, whispering, "That's how we all win." "Yeah." He sat there a moment longer, lost in thought, before finally standing and turning out the light. But as he left the studio, he made a silent promise to himself that this wouldn't just be another episode, that he would make sure the message reached beyond the stage. And he did. A week later, the episode aired. It wasn't marketed as a special, but it didn't need to be. The story spoke for itself. Within 24 hours, the clip of Ryan's conversation with Steve had over 50 million views. News outlets picked it up. Comment sections overflowed with gratitude, with confessions, with memories. Parents wrote things like, "My kids are starting a kindness club at school because of Ryan." Teachers said, "We played this video in class." The kids cried, then they wanted to do something good. Even strangers who'd never seen Family Feud before shared it, saying, "I didn't know I needed this today." And at the heart of it all was that image, a little boy holding a wooden toy truck, sitting across from Steve Harvey, reminding the world that kindness was still alive. Weeks later, Steve invited Ryan and his family back, not for another episode, but for something quieter, a small reunion. No cameras, just connection. When they walked into his office, Steve greeted them with open arms. "You know, y'all changed me," he said, smiling. "I thought I was out here making folks laugh, but you made me want to live better." Ryan looked up, eyes bright. "You already do," he said. Steve laughed softly. "Well, maybe now I'll do it louder." They sat together for a long while, talking about life, dreams, and faith. Ryan told him he wanted to build more libraries, maybe one in every country if he could. Steve promised to help. "Tell you what," Steve said, leaning forward. "We can start with one right here in Georgia, you and me, partner." Ryan's eyes widened. "Really?" Steve smiled. "Really. Let's keep this kindness going." And they did. Over the next year, Steve Harvey quietly partnered with the Bright Box Project to fund several scholarship and literacy initiatives across low-income schools. No publicity, no red carpets, just real change. Months later, during an heinous interview, a reporter asked Steve why that episode had affected him so deeply. He paused before answering. "Because that boy reminded me of something my mama used to tell me," he said. She said, "Son, when you stand on a stage, you better leave something behind that can outlive you." And that day, he did. The interviewer smiled. "Do you think the world listened?" Steve looked off camera for a moment, his expression soft. "Yeah," he said. "I think, for a little while, it remembered how to breathe again." And somewhere, far from the lights and the fame, a little boy sat at his desk, writing another letter, this time addressed not to a host or a studio, but to the world itself. "Thank you for listening. Keep being kind. Even small things make big changes." That letter would later appear on Ryan's website, where millions of children could read it and leave their own stories of kindness in response. It became a digital wall of hope messages from across the world, written by children who now believed that they, too, could make a difference. And on a quiet night in Atlanta, Steve Harvey scrolled through that page on his phone, tears welling again. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "You did it, kid. You really did it." Then he smiled that big, soulful Steve Harvey smile and leaned back in his chair as if exhaling the weight of the world. "Sometimes," he said softly, "television doesn't just entertain, it heals." If this story touched your heart, don't just leave quietly, tell us in the comments below. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Was it a word, a moment, or something it reminded you of in your own life? We read every single message because your stories keep this space alive. And if you believe the world still needs moments like this, hit subscribe, join our family, and help us keep remembering the stories that deserve to be told. This is Stories Left Behind, where human stories are never lost, and where your story might be the next one we tell. This is Way,